February 23, 1942, 7:18 p.m. Pacific Time, a Japanese submarine surfaced less than 3 miles off the California coast near Santa Barbara and fired a single torpedo that exploded against an oil refinery pier. And in that moment, everything the U.S. military had been telling the American people about how safe we were, how protected our coastline was, how the war was something happening far away in Europe and Asia, all that collapsed because the enemy wasn't far away anymore. The enemy was right here firing weapons at American soil. And what happened in the week after that explosion? What really happened versus what the official reports say happened? That's what I'm going to tell you about today because I was there, I saw it, and I've kept my mouth shut for 80 years, but I'm old now, I'm living outside the country. And the people who told me to never speak about this are mostly dead, so I figure it's time somebody told the truth about how close we came to a real disaster and about who actually prevented it and about who took credit for preventing it. And those two groups of people ain't the same. My name's Dean, Sergeant Dean, though that ain't the name I was born with. We're changing names in these stories for security reasons and because I don't want nobody getting sued or harassed over things that happened when most of you watching this weren't even born yet. But what I'm about to tell you is true, every word of it. And I got letters from other veterans and from their families backing up what I'm saying. And I got documents that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago. And I got memories that are still sharp, even though my body sure as hell ain't. So let me take you back to that night in February 1942 when everything changed and when a group of regular soldiers figured out something important that their commanding officers refused to listen to until it was almost too late. I was 20 years old in February 1942. I'd been in the Army for 8 months. I was stationed at Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, California, part of a coastal defense unit that was supposed to be watching for Japanese attacks. And I'm going to be honest with you. Before that night, most of us thought our job was basically pretend work. We'd stand watch, we'd scan the ocean with binoculars, we'd run drills. But nobody really believed the Japanese were going to come all the way across the Pacific to attack California. That seemed crazy. That seemed like something from a radio drama, not something that could actually happen. And our commanding officer, I'm going to call him Colonel Morrison, though that ain't his real name. Morrison had been very clear in his briefings that the Japanese Navy did not have the capability to threaten the American mainland. He said their submarines didn't have the range. He said their strategy was defensive, not offensive. He said we were perfectly safe and that our job was mainly to reassure civilians, not to actually defend against a realistic threat. Then that torpedo hit, and suddenly everything Morrison had been telling us was proven wrong in the loudest way possible. I was off duty when it happened. I was in the barracks playing cards with 3 other guys, and we heard this boom. Not super loud, but loud enough that we all looked at each other like, what the hell was that? And then the sirens started going off and somebody came running through yelling that we were under attack, that a Japanese submarine had fired on the coast. And I remember thinking, this has got to be a drill. This has got to be Morrison testing our response time, because there was no way the Japanese were actually here, except it wasn't a drill. The explosion was real, the submarine was real, and in the next 2 hours our entire unit went from relaxed peacetime duty to realizing that the war had just arrived on our doorstep and we weren't prepared for it. The official story, the one that got reported in newspapers and that's in the history books, says that military forces responded quickly and effectively to the submarine attack, says that defensive measures were immediately implemented, says that the situation was brought under control through decisive leadership, and all of that is technically true, but it leaves out so much of what actually happened that it's basically a lie. What really happened was chaos. What really happened was a week of confusion and mistakes and near disasters that got covered up because admitting the truth would have made the military look incompetent right when they needed the American people to have confidence in them. And I ain't saying the cover-up was wrong necessarily. Maybe it was the right move for morale and for the war effort. But I'm saying that the men who actually figured out what was going on and who actually prevented worse attacks never got any credit, while the officers who screwed up initially got promoted and decorated. Let me tell you what happened in the hours right after that torpedo hit. Colonel Morrison called an emergency briefing at 2100 hours, that's 9 p.m. for you civilians, and every officer and senior NCO in the fort crammed into this room. And Morrison stood up there, and the first thing he said, I remember this exactly, he said, "Gentlemen, we have experienced what appears to be an isolated incident of enemy harassment. 1 submarine, 1 torpedo, minimal damage, no casualties. This does not represent a credible ongoing threat, and we should not overreact." And I was standing in the back of that room, and I looked around and I could see other guys, enlisted men like me, and we were all thinking the same thing, which was, how the hell does he know it's isolated? How does he know there ain't more submarines out there? How does he know this ain't the beginning of something bigger? But nobody said nothing because Morrison was a colonel, and we were sergeants and privates, and you don't question a colonel's assessment in front of everybody. But after the briefing, a group of us, maybe 6 or 7 enlisted men, we got together outside and we started talking about what we'd seen. because several of us had been on watch duty at different points along the coast in the days before the attack, and we started comparing notes, and patterns started emerging that were troubling. One guy, Private Kowalski, he'd been on watch 2 nights before, and he swore he'd seen what looked like a periscope about 4 miles offshore, just for a second. Just a glimpse, but he'd reported it to his sergeant, and the sergeant had told him it was probably a dolphin or a piece of driftwood and not to create paperwork over nothing. Another guy, Corporal Rodriguez, he'd noticed what he described as weird wave patterns on 3 separate occasions over the past week. Patterns that didn't match the normal ocean swells, patterns that looked like something big moving underwater. And he'd mentioned this to Lieutenant Hayes, and Hayes had literally laughed at him and said, "Corporal, are you a trained oceanographer or are you a soldier? Because unless you got a degree in marine science, I suggest you leave the wave analysis to the experts." We started putting together a picture that none of the officers wanted to hear, which was that the Japanese submarine that fired that torpedo probably hadn't just shown up that day. It had probably been operating off our coast for at least a week, maybe longer, observing our defenses, mapping our patrol patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. And if one submarine had been doing that, then maybe others were doing it too. Maybe there was a whole group of them out there right now watching us, and if that was true, then we needed to change everything about how we were operating because our current procedures assumed we had plenty of warning before any attack, we had predictable patrol schedules, we had searchlights that followed the same patterns every night, we had blind spots in our coverage that we'd never bothered to fix because we didn't think anybody was actually watching. But if submarines had been observing us for a week, they knew all our weaknesses, and they could exploit them. I was the one who said we should take this analysis to Colonel Morrison. Looking back, that was probably stupid of me, because I was just a sergeant and Morrison had already made clear he thought the attack was isolated. But I was young, and I genuinely believed that if we presented the evidence clearly, he'd have to take it seriously. So the next morning I requested a meeting, me and Kowalski and Rodriguez, and we laid out everything we'd observed, the periscope sighting, the wave pattern, the timing of the attack, which happened exactly during a gap in our patrol schedule. All of it, and Morrison listened. I'll give him that. He sat there, and he listened to 3 enlisted men tell him that his assessment was wrong. And when we finished, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Gentlemen, I appreciate your initiative and your concern for base security. But what you're describing is speculation based on incomplete observations by untrained personnel, the Navy's intelligence. Analysts have reviewed the situation, and they confirmed this was an isolated incident. 1 submarine, 1 attack, now contained. I cannot justify overhauling our entire defensive posture based on speculation from enlisted men who, with all due respect, do not have access to the full intelligence picture." Dismissed. That phrase, "with all due respect," is military speak for shut up and get back to work. And that's what we did. We got dismissed and we went back to our regular duties, but we didn't stop thinking about it. And over the next few days, more stuff happened that made us more convinced we were right and Morrison was wrong. There were more sightings, more weird patterns, and some of the guys started noticing that civilian fishing boats were avoiding certain areas of the ocean, like the fishermen knew something we didn't. So we started talking to some of the locals, guys who've been fishing these waters for decades, and they told us, yeah, they definitely noticed unusual submarine activity. They'd seen periscopes. They'd seen oil slicks in places there shouldn't be oil slicks. They'd seen bubbles rising to the surface in patterns that suggested something big moving below. And when we asked why they hadn't reported this to military authorities, they said, "We did. We reported it to the Coast Guard and to the Navy, and they told us we were seeing things and that we shouldn't spread panic." So we had enlisted men seeing things. We had civilian fishermen seeing things. We had physical evidence like wave patterns and oil slicks. But the official position was still that there was no credible ongoing threat, and I started realizing that this wasn't about evidence. This was about ego. Colonel Morrison had publicly stated that the attack was isolated. He'd reassured his superiors that the situation was under control, and admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he'd been dismissive of legitimate warnings, would mean admitting that enlisted men had better tactical awareness than he did. And officers don't like to admit those things, especially not in wartime when confidence in leadership is considered essential to military effectiveness. Here's where the story gets really interesting. On the night of February 28th, 5 days after the initial torpedo attack, I was on watch duty at the southern perimeter, and I spotted what looked like a periscope about 2 miles offshore. It was only visible for maybe 3 seconds, but I was sure of what I'd seen, and I immediately reported it through official channels. And Lieutenant Hayes, same guy who'd laughed at Rodriguez about wave patterns, Hayes came to my position, and he scanned the water with binoculars for about 30 seconds, and then he turned to me and said, "Sergeant Dean, I don't see anything. Are you certain about what you saw?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm certain." And Hayes said, "Well, I'm not seeing it now, and I'm not going to create an incident report based on one enlisted man's possible misidentification. You're tired. You've been stressed since the attack. Sometimes in these conditions, people see things that aren't there. I want to note in the log that you reported a possible sighting but that it could not be confirmed. Let's leave it at that. That's when I made a decision that probably should have gotten me court-martialed, but that I still think was the right decision. I decided I wasn't going to wait for permission to take defensive action. Me and Kowalski and Rodriguez and a couple other guys who believed us, we started making unauthorized changes to our defensive setup. We moved searchlights to cover blind spots. We altered our patrol patterns so they weren't predictable. We set up additional observation posts in positions that gave us better visibility of the areas where we've been seeing suspicious activity. We coordinated with the civilian fishermen to get real-time reports of anything unusual, and we did all of this without telling our officers because we knew they'd order us to stop, and technically what we were doing was insubordination. We were implementing tactical changes without authorization. But we figured it was better to face discipline later than to let our base get hit because we'd followed improper procedures. And here's the thing, it worked. Over the next week, we spotted 3 more possible submarine periscopes. We documented patterns of movement that suggested coordinated activity by multiple vessels. We identified specific times and locations where the base was most vulnerable, and we adjusted our defenses accordingly. And during this time, there were no more attacks. The submarines were still out there, but they weren't firing. And I think the reason they weren't firing was because they realized we'd changed our patterns. They realized we were adapting. They realized they couldn't predict our movements anymore. And so they withdrew to find easier targets. But the official record doesn't reflect any of this. The official record says that the February 23rd torpedo attack was an isolated incident and that military forces maintained effective defensive posture throughout the period. No mention of the additional sightings, no mention of the unauthorized tactical changes that actually prevented further attacks. Nothing. What the official record does say is that Colonel Morrison implemented innovative defensive measures in response to the attack and that these measures significantly enhanced coastal security. And as a result of these innovations, Morrison was promoted to Brigadier General and received the Commendation for his decisive leadership during a critical period. And I ain't making this up, I got the citation right here. It specifically credits Morrison with recognizing the potential for ongoing enemy submarine activity and proactively adapting defensive strategies to counter this threat. Which is interesting because that's exactly what he refused to do when we tried to tell him about the ongoing submarine activity. But somewhere between refusing to listen to us and getting his promotion, somebody rewrote the story to make it look like the defensive changes were his idea. Now, I want to be real clear about something. I ain't bitter about this. I didn't join the Army expecting to get credit for everything I did, and I understand how military bureaucracy works. Officers get credit for the successes that happen under their command, even if enlisted men did the actual work. That's just how it is, and I accepted that a long time ago. But what has bothered me is that the real story got buried. The story of how a group of enlisted men saw a threat that their officers denied. How they took unauthorized action to address that threat. How they probably prevented additional attacks and saved lives. That story never got told because telling it would have required admitting that the official assessment was wrong and that junior personnel had better judgment than senior leadership, and the military can't admit that. Or at least they couldn't back then. Maybe things are different now, I don't know. Let me tell you about one specific incident that happened during this week that really illustrates what I'm talking about. On March 3rd, 8 days after the initial attack, we got word that a Navy destroyer had detected what they believed was a submarine contact about 15 miles offshore. They were preparing to depth charge the area. And standard procedures said that coastal units should maintain heightened alert status but otherwise continue normal operations. But Rodriguez and me, we'd been plotting all the sightings and patterns on a map, unauthorized of course. And when we heard about this destroyer contact, we realized that if there really was a submarine at that location, and if it followed the pattern we'd been observing, then it would probably try to escape by moving south along the coast, and it would pass within 3 miles of our position at approximately 0200 hours. And if our searchlights were following their normal pattern at that time, we'd completely miss it. But if we repositioned 2 searchlights to cover the southern approach, then we might be able to spot it. So we did exactly that. We repositioned the lights without authorization, and sure enough, at 0147 hours, 13 minutes earlier than we predicted, we spotted a periscope exactly where we thought it would be. We illuminated it with the searchlights, we reported it immediately. And the Navy destroyer that had been depth charging the area to the north was able to redirect and pursue the submarine as it tried to escape south. And I don't know if they sank it or if it got away, but I know they got close enough to drop more depth charges, and the submarine definitely wasn't able to continue operating in that area. And that was a success. That was genuine tactical coordination that worked. But when Lieutenant Hayes filed a report about this incident, he described it as routine execution of standard observation protocols resulting in fortuitous submarine detection. No mention that we'd predicted where the submarine would be. No mention that we'd repositioned searchlights against standard procedure. Nothing that would indicate enlisted men had done independent tactical analysis, because admitting that would raise questions about why the officers hadn't done that analysis themselves. After about 2 weeks, the submarine activity died down. Either they'd left the area or they got more cautious, and things slowly returned to normal, and I thought that would be the end of it. I thought we'd just go back to regular duty and nobody would ever talk about what had really happened. But then about 6 weeks later, Colonel Morrison, now Brigadier General Morrison, held a base-wide formation and gave a speech about the importance of vigilance and adaptability in coastal defense. And he talked about how the February attack had taught us valuable lessons about enemy capabilities, and he said that thanks to proactive tactical innovations we had successfully deterred further enemy action. And the whole time he was talking, I was standing there thinking, those tactical innovations you're taking credit for are the same ideas you called speculation from untrained personnel 6 weeks ago. But I didn't say nothing. I just stood there at attention, and I watched a man get praised for doing exactly what he'd initially refused to do. And I realized that's how it works. That's how the system works. The men who actually do the thinking and the problem-solving stay invisible, while the men in charge get credit for results they initially opposed. Years later, I'm talking decades later in the 1970s, I tried to get the real story on record. I contacted military historians. I submitted written accounts of what happened. I tried to get interviews with other veterans who'd been there, and I got nowhere. The official history of coastal defense in early 1942 was already written. It was already in textbooks. And nobody was interested in revising it based on the testimony of enlisted men who claimed that the official version was incomplete. One historian told me, even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it isn't, there's no documentary evidence to support it. The official reports don't mention any of the activities you described, and without documentation we can't include it in the historical record, which is a nice way of saying if it ain't in the official paperwork, it didn't happen. But the reason it wasn't in the official paperwork is because the officers writing the paperwork deliberately left it out because including it would have made them look bad. So that's the story. That's what really happened in the week after a Japanese submarine torpedoed California. A group of young enlisted men figured out that there was an ongoing threat. They tried to report it through proper channels and got ignored. They took unauthorized action to protect their base that probably prevented additional attacks, and then they watched while their commanding officer took credit for innovations he'd initially opposed. And none of this appears in the official records because acknowledging it would have required admitting that leadership failed to recognize a threat that junior personnel identified, and that kind of admission doesn't happen in military bureaucracy. Or it didn't then. Maybe it does now, but I doubt it. Now let me ask you something. Do you think this kind of thing still happens today? Do you think there are still situations where people on the ground see problems that their supervisors don't want to hear about, where junior employees or soldiers or workers identify threats or opportunities that management ignores because it contradicts their existing beliefs, where the people who actually solve problems don't get credit because giving them credit would mean admitting the official approach was wrong? I'm asking because I see patterns in civilian life that look a lot like what I experienced in the military. I see companies where frontline workers know exactly what's wrong but management won't listen. I see organizations where the people doing the actual work get ignored while executives take credit for success. And I wonder if maybe the problem I experienced in 1942 is just a specific example of a much bigger problem about how hierarchies work and how people in power protect their egos even when it costs effectiveness. The Japanese submarine that fired that torpedo on February 23, 1942, was the I-17. That's documented historical fact. The submarine survived the war. It operated in the Pacific until 1943, when it was sunk by New Zealand forces. The attack on California was considered a success by the Japanese Navy because it created panic and forced the U.S. to divert resources to coastal defense. But what most people don't know is how close that submarine and probably several others came to conducting additional attacks. And what prevented those additional attacks wasn't brilliant leadership from senior officers. It was junior enlisted men doing independent tactical analysis and taking unauthorized defensive measures, and those men never got recognized. Their names don't appear in any official histories. And if you look up the February 1942 submarine attack on California, you'll read that military forces responded effectively under the leadership of commanders who quickly adapted to the threat, which is true in the sense that the military did respond and we did adapt, but it ain't true in terms of who actually did the adapting and who actually figured out what needed to be done. I kept in touch with some of the guys who were involved in this, Kowalski and Rodriguez and a couple others. We'd get together every few years and we'd talk about what happened, and we'd always laugh about it, not with bitterness, but with this kind of ironic acceptance, like, of course that's how it went, of course we did the work and someone else got the credit, that's just how the world works. And we never tried to claim credit publicly. We never tried to set the record straight in any official way because we understood that the system wasn't designed to recognize what we'd done. The system was designed to maintain confidence in leadership, and our story contradicted that goal, so our story got buried, and I was okay with that for a long time. I figured the important thing was that we protected our base and probably saved lives, and whether we got credit didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But I'm old now, I'm 80 years old, most of the guys I serve with are dead, Morrison is dead, the officers who ignored us are dead, and I started thinking maybe it's time somebody told the truth, not because I want recognition, I don't need recognition at this age, but because I think the story has lessons that are still relevant, lessons about how organizations handle information from junior personnel, lessons about how ego and hierarchy can prevent good ideas from being heard, lessons about how the official version of events is often incomplete or deliberately misleading. And I think those are lessons that people need to hear, especially young people who are just starting their careers and who are going to face situations where they see problems that their supervisors don't want to acknowledge. And I want those young people to know that they ain't crazy, they ain't wrong. Sometimes junior personnel really do have better awareness than senior leadership, and sometimes doing the right thing means taking unauthorized action and accepting that you probably won't get credit for it. So that's why I'm telling this story now. That's why I'm digging up these buried files and putting them out there for anyone who wants to hear them. And I don't expect the military to change the official history. I don't expect anyone to issue corrections or acknowledgments. I just want the truth preserved somewhere. I want there to be a record that says, this is what really happened. These are the men who really solved the problem. And this is how the system buried their contribution. And if you're watching this and you've experienced something similar, if you've been in a situation where you identified a problem and got ignored and then watched someone else take credit for solving it, I want you to know you ain't alone. This has been happening forever. It's still happening today. And the only way to fight it is to tell the truth and preserve the stories of the people who actually do the work, even when the official records give credit to someone else. I got one more thing to say before I end this, which is that I don't want anyone thinking I'm attacking Colonel Morrison or the other officers who were in charge during this incident. They were operating under enormous pressure. They had responsibilities that I didn't fully understand at the time. They were making decisions based on information and priorities that I wasn't privy to. And it's possible that from their perspective, they were doing everything right, so I ain't saying they were bad people or incompetent leaders. I'm just saying they were wrong about this one specific thing. They were wrong to dismiss the warnings from enlisted men. They were wrong to ignore evidence of ongoing submarine activity. And they were wrong to take credit for defensive measures that they initially opposed. And those wrongs don't make them villains, they make them human. They make them examples of how normal people in positions of authority can make mistakes and then protect their egos instead of admitting those mistakes. And that's worth understanding, that's worth studying, because we all do it. We all make mistakes and then tell stories that make us look better. And the difference between enlisted men doing that and officers doing that is just the scale of consequences and whether the official record preserves your version or someone else's. So share this story if you think it's worth sharing. Leave a comment telling me whether you've experienced something similar, and subscribe if you want more of these buried files, because I got plenty more stories. Stories about improvised tactics that saved lives but violated regulations. Stories about junior personnel who solved problems that baffled their supervisors. Stories about how the official record lies not by what it says but by what it leaves out, and all of these stories are true. All of them are based on documents and testimony that I preserved for decades, and all of them teach lessons about how military organizations work and how those lessons apply to civilian life. So stick around, there's more coming. And thank you for listening to this old man ramble about things that happened 80 years ago. But that still matter today because human nature don't change and bureaucracy don't change, and the tendency of people in power to protect their egos at the expense of truth don't change. And until those things change, we need people telling these stories and preserving these memories. So that's what I'm doing. That's what Sergeant Dean's Buried Files is all about. The stories they didn't want told, the truths they tried to bury, and the lessons we still need to learn.